Across the endless expanse of the galaxy, where suns rise and fall over countless worlds, and the hum of the Force binds every living thing, there is one figure whose story echoes not with the thunder of conquest, but with the quiet strength of endurance. And that is Obi Wan Kenobi, a man remembered not only as a Jedi Knight, a general, or even a hermit, but as a watcher, a guardian who bore the weight of hope through the galaxy's darkest hours. And to listen to his tale is to drift across the years, from the innocence of a boy plucked from his homeworld of Tatooine to the wisdom of an old man whose life was defined by service, loss, and unyielding compassion. He was, in many ways, a paradox. A warrior who longed for peace, a teacher who feared the fragility of his own lessons, a man who carried discipline like a shield, and yet bore within him the deep sorrow of failure. And yet through it all, Obi-Wan remained, steady as a star in the night sky, refusing to be extinguished even when the galaxy itself seemed to collapse around him. To the younglings of the temple, he had once been a stern and studious figure, a boy who valued the code more than laughter, striving always to master the forms of lightsaber combat and the intricacies of Jedi philosophy. To Qui-Gon Jinn, his maverick master, he was both a challenge and a revelation, a reminder that loyalty and caution could be virtues even in a galaxy too often ruled by impulse. To Anakin Skywalker, he became brother, teacher, and reluctant father figure, tasked with shaping the destiny of the Chosen One, while struggling to reconcile his own doubts with Qui-Gon's dying wish. And to Luke Skywalker, he was Ben Kenobi, the strange hermit of the Dune Sea, whose wisdom seemed hidden beneath dust and silence until the moment destiny came knocking. His life was not one of ease or triumph, but of sacrifice, standing against Darth Maul at Naboo, fighting through the endless campaigns of the Clone Wars, facing the heartbreak of Anakin's fall on the burning shores of Mustafar, and enduring 2 decades of solitude beneath the twin suns of Tatooine, where each day was a test of patience and faith as he watched over the boy who represented the galaxy's last hope. Through every trial, every heartbreak, every burden he carried, Obi-Wan became more than the sum of his battles. He became a living lesson in endurance, in compassion, and in the simple yet profound truth that sometimes the greatest heroism lies not in victory, but in survival, in continuing to stand watch even when the world seems to have forgotten you. Tonight, as we tell his story, we will follow him from those earliest days of innocence through the weight of his trials and the silence of his exile, and we will come to see why Obi-Wan Kenobi, more than almost any other, remains a light in the galaxy's memory, a watcher in the stars whose legacy shines on, soft and steady, a beacon against the dark. The story of Obi-Wan Kenobi begins in mystery, as so many Jedi stories do, with fragments of knowledge and whispers carried through the years. For though we know that he was born on the distant world of Tatooine, little else survives of his earliest days, his parents, or the circumstances of his birth. And in this way, his life mirrors the way of the Jedi themselves, an existence that begins in separation, in the letting go of one's past, in order to embrace the service of the greater whole. Tatooine itself is scarcely known in the records of the Republic, a quiet and unassuming planet whose name only surfaced because Obi-Wan himself, in his later years, revealed it in passing, as though the details of his childhood were unimportant compared to the life he had chosen to live. And yet we can imagine the boy before the Jedi came for him, small, keen-eyed, perhaps already showing the sparks of perception that would one day define him as a man whose awareness reached further and deeper than most. To be taken by the Jedi was no theft, but a ritual of the Order, for when children were discovered to be sensitive to the Force, they were offered a path beyond the boundaries of their birth, a chance to live not as individuals bound to family or heritage, but as threads in the greater tapestry of the galaxy's destiny. And so, sometime in his first years, young Obi-Wan was brought to Coruscant, that shining capital of the Republic, to enter the great temple whose spires rose like fingers into the sky, home to thousands of years of tradition, knowledge, and discipline. What he left behind on Stujón, his parents, his possible siblings, the sights and smells of the world of his birth, we will never know. And perhaps Obi-Wan himself never fully remembered. For the Jedi way was to let go, to free oneself of attachment, to shape identity not from what came before, but from what one chose to become. It is tempting to imagine the child he once was, small in stature yet serious of mind, his eyes already betraying the deep sense of watchfulness that would define him, boarding a transport that carried him across the stars, leaving behind the soil of Stujón for the stone floors and towering halls of the Jedi Temple. From the moment he entered those hallowed chambers, his life was no longer his own, but a service to the Force, a journey guided by teachers who would mold him into the disciplined, contemplative figure history would come to know. There are whispers in legends that his childhood before the temple was marked by a fierce independence, that his parents had struggled with the choice to give him up, that perhaps Obi-Wan himself resisted at first, as any child might, torn between the love of family and the call of destiny. But if such things are true, he never spoke of them, carrying his origins with the same quiet dignity with which he bore all of life's burdens. For Obi-Wan, unlike so many others, the past was not a chain but a foundation, and if his beginnings were cloaked in silence, it only allowed him to step more fully into the role the Force had chosen for him. As a child of the Jedi, he was one of many, yet even among the crowded dormitories and the endless lessons, he distinguished himself not by brashness or overwhelming talent, but by focus, by a seriousness that some found too rigid, but which would one day prove to be the steel at his core when all else fell away. The mystery of his origins is, in truth, a kind of poetry, for Obi Wan Kenobi was never meant to be defined by where he came from, but by what he became. A Jedi whose life would bridge eras, who would know both the Order at its height and its destruction, who would be apprentice, master, general, and exile, and who, through all these transformations, carried the essence of that youngling from Stujón, earnest, watchful, and quietly determined. His story reminds us that greatness often springs not from grand beginnings, but from the willingness to step into the unknown, to leave behind the comfort of what we know and embrace the call of something greater. And so it is fitting that we do not know much of the boy who first left Stujón, for the galaxy would come to know him not as a child of any one world, but as Obi Wan Kenobi, Jedi Knight, whose true origin lay not in a birthplace, but in the eternal current of the Force. If Obi Wan Kenobi's life would later be measured in duels and decisions, in triumphs and heartbreaks, its first chapters remain cloaked in a silence that lends him a certain timelessness, as though he emerged fully formed from the stone halls of the temple. Yet when we lean closer, we can trace faint outlines of the boy he once was, the seeds of the man he would become, and the weight of what it means to never truly know your own beginnings. His homeworld, Stujón, appears in the archives not with detail, but with a whisper, a name given in a single conversation during his later years, and from that whisper, the galaxy has tried to imagine the place that shaped his first breaths. Was it a world of sweeping plains where children ran freely beneath an open sky? Or a land of quiet villages where families clung together in warmth against the cold of night? We do not know, and perhaps Obi-Wan himself scarcely remembered, for by the time he was old enough to recall faces and voices, the Jedi had already become his family, and Stu-Jon a distant dream lost to the current of the Force. What we do know is this: he was identified as sensitive to the Force at an early age, his potential strong enough to draw the attention of the Jedi recruiters who searched the Outer Rim and beyond, bringing back to Coruscant the brightest sparks they could find to kindle into protectors of peace. For Obi-Wan, this meant leaving behind parents whose names history does not record, whose arms released him into the hands of the Jedi with the knowledge that they would never see him again. And though the Order taught that such separations were necessary, that attachments must be severed so that the child could grow without fear or longing, one can imagine the ache that lingered in that parting, the unspoken love pressed into the boy's memory before he was taken away. Perhaps Obi-Wan, even as a child, bore it with unusual grace, his quiet nature accepting of what the Force asked of him. Or perhaps he cried as any child would, the pain of that moment buried deep enough that only years of meditation allowed him to reshape it into discipline. In this way, the mystery of his origins is not an absence but a lesson, for it reflects the Jedi's way of shaping identity. You are not who you were born to be, but who you choose to become through the will of the Force. By the time he arrived on Coruscant, the massive city world that hummed with speeders and towered with spires reaching higher than the clouds, Obi-Wan's destiny was already being written, not in stone, but in the choices he would make and in the way he would learn to listen to the Force's call. The temple that became his home was vast and magnificent, with marble floors polished by centuries of footsteps. Gardens where the younglings played under the careful eye of instructors, and training rooms where the hum of practice sabers filled the air like a steady drumbeat. For Obi-Wan, it was here, not on Stu-Jon, that life truly began. His earliest memories of belonging tied not to family, but to the Order, to the code recited each morning, to the glow of the archives where knowledge stretched endlessly, to the voices of peers who would become brothers and sisters, not by blood, but by purpose. The Jedi taught him to let go of what he had lost, to release longing into the current of the Force, and though he would not speak of his childhood in later years, we can see in his discipline, his clarity, and his loyalty the echoes of those lessons, that he was a boy who learned early to bear loss quietly, to carry duty above desire, and to find strength not in what was taken from him, but in what he could give to others. This is why the mystery of Obi-Wan's origins is less about what we do not know and more about what it tells us of the man, that greatness can emerge from obscurity, that the soil of one's birth matters less than the choices of one's life, and that the Force, in its infinite wisdom, can take a child from a world forgotten and raise him into a guardian whose name will be remembered across the stars. For Obi Wan Kenobi, the story did not begin with Stu-Jon. It began with the first time he opened himself to the Force in the temple, the first time he looked beyond himself and felt the vastness of all living things. And in that moment, the boy became part of something greater, his origin not a world or a family, but the luminous field that binds the galaxy together. The Jedi Temple on Coruscant was not merely a building of stone and light, but a world unto itself, a vast sanctuary where thousands of younglings were nurtured, trained, and shaped into vessels of the Force. And it was here that Obi Wan Kenobi's childhood truly unfolded, in dormitories filled with laughter and whispered rivalries, in training halls where the clash of practice sabers echoed like distant thunder, and in meditation gardens where fountains whispered and statues of ancient masters looked on in silence. For Obi-Wan, life in the temple was both a privilege and a crucible, demanding discipline even as it offered a kind of belonging far different from the family he had left behind on Stujon. As a youngling, he was not the most flamboyant, nor the most daring, qualities often celebrated among his peers, but instead he carried himself with a quiet intensity, a seriousness that sometimes set him apart. For while others played boisterously, Obi-Wan would sit in thought, memorizing passages from the Jedi Code or practicing the precise forms of basic lightsaber stances long after the lessons had ended. Yet beneath that solemnity, there was also the eagerness of a boy who desperately wanted to prove himself, who wanted to be worthy of the order that had taken him in, and this combination, discipline and yearning, would come to define his entire life. In the communal classes where history of the Jedi was recited, Obi-Wan's hand was quick to rise, his answers measured and exact, while in sparring matches, though his frame was smaller than many of his peers, his dedication to form and his refusal to give up often allowed him to stand against opponents more physically. In training halls where the clash of practice sabers echoed like distant thunder, and in meditation gardens where fountains whispered and statues of ancient masters looked on in silence. For Obi-Wan, life in the temple was both a privilege and a crucible, demanding discipline even as it offered a kind of belonging far different from the family he had left behind on Stujon. As a youngling, he was not the most flamboyant, nor the most daring, qualities often celebrated among his peers, but instead he carried himself with a quiet intensity, a seriousness that sometimes set him apart. For while others played boisterously, Obi-Wan would sit in thought, Padawan by a Jedi Knight or Master, and to leave the safety of the temple for the galaxy beyond. Obi-Wan longed for this moment, his heart set on the dream of service, and though he sometimes doubted his own worthiness, he pressed himself harder, as though every meditation, every drill, every recitation was a step toward proving that he belonged among the Jedi. Yet even in these early years, there were challenges. Obi-Wan's tendency toward strictness, his black and white view of right and wrong, sometimes put him at odds with more playful peers, and the teasing he endured for being by the book left him alternately defensive and quietly determined to let his actions speak louder than words. In the archives, he would lose himself for hours, wandering between towering shelves of holocrons and data crystals, absorbing the stories of the Jedi who had come before him, and perhaps in these tales he found both comfort and a measure of identity, telling himself that one day his life too might be written among these records. Training in the Force came with trials that tested not only strength but patience, learning to lift pebbles before attempting larger stones, to feel the life of plants in the gardens before sensing the minds of others, to steady his breath even when frustration threatened to unsettle him, and Obi-Wan, though not without moments of struggle, excelled in perseverance, pushing through difficulty with a quiet stubbornness that earned him both admiration and gentle warnings not to let pride harden into inflexibility. At night, lying in the dormitory beneath the tall windows that looked out over the endless cityscape of Coruscant, he would sometimes wonder about the stars, about the families who lived on the worlds beyond, about the life he might have had if the Jedi had not found him. And though such thoughts were fleeting, they revealed the part of him that was always watching, always questioning, a part that would later make him both a cautious master and a man haunted by what-ifs. The temple was his cradle, his school, his entire universe, and within its walls Obi Wan Kenobi was molded into the boy who would one day become a Padawan, learning lessons that would shape his soul, that the Force was a current to be trusted, that discipline was the anchor of strength, and that the greatest calling of all was to serve something larger than oneself. It was here, among the echoing halls and shimmering towers, that Obi-Wan's true childhood passed, not in games or stories told at a hearth, but in the rituals of training, the wisdom of masters, and the unyielding pursuit of balance. And though he could not know it then, every step he took as a youngling was guiding him toward the path of destiny, a path that would demand more of him than he could possibly imagine. In those long years as a youngling, Obi Wan Kenobi grew from a child wide-eyed with wonder at the towering halls of the Jedi Temple into a disciplined student who had begun to embody the calm and rigor that would one day mark him as one of the Order's most reliable knights. And yet the path was not without its struggles, for the life of a youngling was as demanding as it was enlightening, filled with daily lessons that tested not only the mind and body, but the heart. Each morning began with meditation in the gathering halls. Hundreds of young voices hushed into stillness as the masters taught them to quiet their minds and open themselves to the current of the Force. And though many fidgeted or let their thoughts wander, Obi-Wan was noted for his unusual focus, sitting still for longer than most, his brow furrowed in concentration, as if even as a boy he understood that the Force was not a toy but a mystery that demanded reverence. In physical training he excelled not through brute strength but through precision, memorizing the katas of Form 1 and Form 2 with such care that his instructors remarked on his dedication, even when his peers teased him for his stiffness. For where others leapt and spun with flair, Obi-Wan was exacting, deliberate, his blade striking the practice droid at the same angle every time until the movement was flawless. He was not the star pupil in every subject. In areas requiring intuition or improvisation, he sometimes faltered, his need for order making it difficult for him to bend as freely as some of the more naturally gifted younglings. But in those moments he pushed harder, his determination carrying him through until the lesson was learned. Outside of lessons, life in the temple was a world unto itself. Dormitories filled with laughter, whispers after lights out as initiates speculated about which knight might one day choose them as Padawan, meals in the great refectories where he sat quietly but always listening, absorbing stories of past missions from the older initiates who returned with wide eyes and tales of strange planets and narrow escapes. Obi-Wan, though reserved, found friendship among his clan, the Bear Clan, where bonds were forged in the shared struggle of training. Yet even here he sometimes stood apart, his seriousness setting him apart from those who preferred mischief or play. When disputes arose, Obi-Wan was quick to appeal to the rules or to an instructor, earning him a reputation as rigid but also trustworthy, someone who would not betray confidence or abandon duty. In the archives, he was a familiar figure, often wandering the quiet halls with hands clasped behind his back, gazing up at towering statues of ancient masters, his mind filled with questions about what it meant to truly serve the Force, questions that hinted at the reflective man he would one day become. And yet, though his instructors praised his diligence, there was concern too, that he was too rigid, too bound by rules, that he lacked the flexibility to listen fully to the living Force. And more than once, he was gently urged to relax, to play, to laugh, to remember that the Jedi path was not simply one of rules, but of harmony. Obi-Wan tried, in his way, joining sparring matches in the temple gardens or chasing after small training droids with his peers. But always there was that gravity about him, that sense of a boy already carrying more than most his age. At times he doubted himself, wondering if he would be chosen at all, for in his quiet heart he knew that without a master to guide him, his time in the temple would end, and he might be sent instead to the agricultural corps, a fate he respected but feared, for to him it would mean failure to live up to the destiny he felt stirring in the Force. And so each day he pressed harder, studied longer, sparred more fiercely, his small body aching as he pushed himself beyond limits, determined that no master could overlook his effort. What he could not yet know was that this very blend of rigidity and persistence, this fierce loyalty to duty even when it weighed heavily on him, was the reason he would one day be chosen by a master as unconventional as Qui-Gon Jinn. For where Obi-Wan sought rules, Qui-Gon sought the living current, and together they would forge a path neither could walk alone. For now, however, Obi-Wan was only a boy, a youngling sitting cross-legged in the training halls, repeating the Jedi code with careful precision, whispering the words as though he could carve them into his soul. There is no emotion, there is peace. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge. There is no passion, there is serenity. There is no death, there is the Force. And in those quiet moments, the mystery of his future stretched before him like the endless cityscape outside the temple windows, vast and uncertain, but filled with the promise that one day his life would matter not for where he came from, but for how steadfastly he would walk the path set before him. Obi Wan Kenobi's life as a Jedi truly began the day he was chosen as Padawan to Qui-Gon Jinn, a moment that marked the transition from the sheltered discipline of the youngling clans to the demanding, unpredictable life of apprenticeship. And though the boy had feared at times that his rigid sense of duty and tendency toward formality would make him unattractive to the knights who sought Padawans, the Force had arranged for a pairing that would challenge him more profoundly than any he could have imagined. For Qui-Gon Jinn was known throughout the Order as a maverick, a Jedi who respected the code but trusted most in the living Force, following its whispers even when they contradicted the Council's wisdom. And for a student like Obi-Wan, who clung so tightly to rules and structure, this partnership would prove both frustrating and transformative. Their first days together were marked by tension as Obi-Wan sought clear instruction and firm boundaries, while Qui-Gon offered riddles, parables, and an expectation that his Padawan learn not by memorizing the written word, but by feeling the flow of life itself. Missions that should have seemed straightforward became lessons in patience and improvisation, as when they traveled to remote settlements where Qui-Gon would spend long hours listening to farmers speak of their crops, rather than diving straight into the dispute at hand, forcing Obi-Wan to understand that service was not about efficiency, but about trust, about giving people the dignity of being heard. In combat training, Obi-Wan's dedication to form and structure impressed Qui-Gon, yet the Master pushed him beyond drills, forcing him to spar against unpredictable opponents, to fight blindfolded, to relinquish his reliance on precision and instead let instinct carry his blade. And though Obi-Wan bristled at such exercises, he could not deny that they honed him into a warrior capable of adapting, of enduring when plans collapsed. The bond between them grew slowly, with friction as its foundation, Obi-Wan often exasperated by Qui-Gon's disregard for protocol. Qui-Gon frustrated by his Padawan's rigidity, yet beneath those clashes was an affection that deepened with each shared trial. On one mission to Mandalore, protecting the young Duchess Satine Kryze, Obi-Wan's world was shaken when he found himself drawn not only to duty, but to compassion, to the stirrings of love that the Jedi way forbade. And it was in Qui-Gon's quiet guidance that he learned the weight of choices that the Code did not fully address. Qui-Gon did not scold him, but allowed him to wrestle with the conflict, teaching him that being a Jedi was not about denying emotion, but about ensuring it did not rule you. On another mission, when negotiations collapsed into violence, Obi-Wan watched his master stand between opposing sides, refusing to draw his saber until no other option remained, and the lesson etched itself deeply into the Padawan's heart, that the Jedi's greatest strength was not in battle, but in restraint. Their journeys carried them across the galaxy, from the frozen peaks of Karlak to the crowded underworld of Coruscant, where Obi-Wan learned to move not as a child of the temple, but as a servant of the people. And though he sometimes struggled to reconcile Qui-Gon's methods with the Council's teachings, he began to glimpse the wisdom that lay between, an understanding that the Jedi Code was not a cage, but a compass, meant to guide, but not to shackle. Slowly, Obi-Wan's loyalty to Qui-Gon grew into something more profound than obedience. It became trust, a willingness to set aside his own doubts and follow his master into uncertainty, even when the path seemed reckless. And in time, Obi-Wan began to see that Qui-Gon's lessons were shaping him into more than the obedient knight he thought he should be. They were shaping him into a man capable of both discipline and compassion, of patience and decisive action, of carrying burdens so heavy that only someone trained in both rule and intuition could bear them. By the time he reached his later Padawan years, Obi-Wan had become not only a skilled warrior, his lightsaber skills polished into elegance, but also a diplomat whose measured words echoed his master's teachings, his once rigid heart softened by experience and yet strengthened by resilience. Their bond, forged in disagreement and tested in trial, became one of the most important relationships of Obi-Wan's life. For Qui-Gon gave him not only guidance, but the sense of belonging that every apprentice seeks. And though Obi-Wan could not know it then, the lessons of those years would become the very foundation upon which he would build his own identity as a Jedi Knight, and later as a master to another. And so the boy from Stujon, once a quiet youngling unsure of his place, became through Qui-Gon's tutelage a true Jedi in the making, standing on the threshold of a destiny that would test every fiber of his being. A destiny that would soon come crashing upon him with the fateful events on Naboo, where master and student would face not only the greatest trial of their bond, but the beginning of a sorrow that would haunt Obi-Wan forever. As the years of apprenticeship stretched on, Obi Wan Kenobi found himself increasingly molded by the paradox that was Qui-Gon Jinn, a master who both embodied and defied the Jedi Order in equal measure. And it was within this tension that Obi-Wan's own character was forged, pulled between the safety of tradition and the unpredictable current of the living Force. He learned that being a Jedi was not a matter of perfect certainty, but of constant balance, of walking a narrow path where every choice echoed far beyond the self. At first, he struggled with Qui-Gon's methods, bristling when his master disregarded the Council's directives in favor of instincts that seemed reckless. Yet slowly, mission by mission, Obi-Wan began to see the wisdom in listening not only to the code, but to the moment itself. On missions to remote worlds, Qui-Gon would linger with farmers, healers, or village elders for hours, letting them speak freely, while Obi-Wan fidgeted, desperate to return to the practical tasks of negotiation or defense. But in time, he realized that these quiet conversations were often where the Force revealed the truth, hidden beneath the surface of politics and appearances. On battlefields, where Obi-Wan's training pushed him toward rigid adherence to form and counter, Qui-Gon would deliberately disrupt his rhythm, sparring with unpredictable strikes that forced his Padawan to release his grip on control and surrender to instinct. And though Obi-Wan often fell, bruised and frustrated, he carried away the lesson each time that the Force was not a formula, but a living, breathing current that flowed through all things. Yet theirs was not a relationship of constant harmony. They quarreled often, Obi-Wan's youthful certainty clashing with Qui-Gon's seasoned defiance. And there were times when Obi-Wan feared he might disappoint his master, that Qui-Gon might one day release him for a Padawan more suited to his ways. But Qui-Gon, beneath his stern exterior, recognized in Obi-Wan a steadiness that he himself lacked, a loyalty to principle that tempered his own inclination toward risk, and rather than seeing Obi-Wan's discipline as a flaw, he nurtured it, testing it, sharpening it, and allowing it to stand as a counterpoint to his own philosophy. Together they traveled far beyond Coruscant, to Alderaan, where Obi-Wan first glimpsed the majesty of diplomacy on a galactic stage, to Mandalore, where guarding the young Duchess Satine Kryze awakened in Obi-Wan feelings that he would carry silently for the rest of his life. Proof that even the most disciplined Jedi was not immune to the stirrings of the heart, to dusty frontier worlds where crime lords and pirates ruled, where Obi-Wan's lightsaber became not only a weapon, but a symbol of hope for those too long forgotten by the Republic. Each mission added layers to his growth, forcing him to reconcile his strict adherence to the code with the messy, unpredictable reality of the galaxy. And under Qui-Gon's watch, he began to weave together both threads, discipline and compassion, duty and instinct, into something uniquely his own. In private moments, when the stars stretched endlessly beyond their ship's viewport, Qui-Gon would speak to him of the living Force, of trusting what one feels rather than what one thinks. And though Obi-Wan would nod, respectful but unconvinced, the seed was planted, a seed that would later bloom in the most unexpected ways when he found himself without his master's guidance. Their bond deepened with each trial, shifting from the wary respect of teacher and student into something more enduring, something close to family. For though Obi-Wan had been taken from his parents as a boy, in Qui-Gon he found both a father and a brother, someone who both infuriated him and anchored him, someone who believed in him even when he doubted himself. Yet Obi-Wan also lived in his master's shadow, quietly fearing that he could never live up to Qui-Gon's expectations, that his rigid nature made him unworthy of the greatness his master seemed to see in him. And it was this tension, love mixed with doubt, that made their relationship so human, so fragile, and so powerful. Looking back, it is clear that these years defined Obi-Wan more than any other. For in Qui-Gon's tutelage, he learned not only the skills of a Jedi, but the philosophy that would sustain him through exile and despair. That a Jedi's duty was not to perfection, but to persistence, not to power, but to service, and that even when the galaxy turned against you, the light was something you carried within, steady and unyielding. Though Obi-Wan could not yet know the sorrow that awaited him, the bond with Qui-Gon shaped the very core of his soul, preparing him painfully, imperfectly, for the crucible that would come on Naboo, where destiny would demand of him a sacrifice that no Padawan should ever have to bear. The Battle of Naboo was the moment that Obi Wan Kenobi's life pivoted from apprenticeship into the heavy mantle of knighthood. A crucible that demanded of him both triumph and unbearable loss. For though he had faced trials before, nothing could have prepared him for the storm that awaited on that verdant world, where the fate of the Republic itself hung in the balance. It began with the uneasy mission that brought Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon Jinn to Naboo, tasked with negotiating peace between the Trade Federation and Queen Padme Amidala. Yet it quickly spiraled into war, revealing the Federation's blockade not as a mere political maneuver, but as the opening move in a vast scheme orchestrated by shadowy powers beyond comprehension. Obi-Wan, ever loyal to Qui-Gon, followed his master through swamps and palaces, standing at his side as they rescued the Queen and forged a fragile alliance with the Gungan people, learning along the way that victory often depended not on strength of arms, but on unity among unlikely allies. Yet as armies clashed on the plains and starfighters soared above, the true test awaited deep within the palace's hangar, where the doors hissed open to reveal the first Sith Lord the Jedi had faced in 1,000 years. Darth Maul, his black and crimson tattoos marking him as something otherworldly, his double-bladed lightsaber igniting with a hiss that echoed like thunder in the soul. Obi-Wan's heart pounded, for though he had sparred against countless opponents in the temple and the field, this was something else entirely, a darkness incarnate, a predator who moved with terrifying precision. Side by side, he and Qui-Gon leapt into battle, blades meeting Maul's in a storm of light and fury, the duel spilling across catwalks and energy barriers, the hum of their sabers merging with the crackle of plasma fields as the very air seemed alive with danger. Obi-Wan fought with all the discipline drilled into him since his youngling days, his strikes crisp and exact, yet he found himself pressed, Maul's savage speed forcing him to adapt, to trust instincts Qui-Gon had long urged him to embrace. Time and again, Obi-Wan's focus saved him, parrying strikes that would have ended another. But it was Qui-Gon who bore the brunt of the duel, his mastery tested against the Sith's relentless assault. They pressed Maul back, the three warriors weaving through the palace's labyrinth of glowing shields, until fate separated master from student, the energy barriers locking Obi-Wan away as he watched helplessly while Qui-Gon faced Maul alone in a final, desperate exchange. Obi-Wan's chest clenched as he saw his master falter, saw the Sith's blade pierce Qui-Gon's body, the light in his eyes dimming as he collapsed to the ground. And in that instant, something broke inside Obi-Wan. Grief and fury surging through him as the shields dropped and he charged forward with a cry, unleashing a flurry of attacks fueled not by calm, but by raw emotion. His strikes came faster than he had ever moved, his blade a blur, his rage momentarily overwhelming the Sith. Yet Maul's cunning prevailed, and with a violent blow, Obi-Wan was disarmed, sent tumbling into a pit, hanging by his fingertips above the abyss. For a breathless moment, defeat seemed certain, death waiting below, but Obi-Wan steadied himself, drawing not on anger but on the lessons Qui-Gon had instilled: patience, trust, and the living force. And in that clarity, he leapt, summoning his master's fallen saber to his hand, and with one decisive strike, he cut Maul in two, sending the Sith's body falling into the darkness. The silence that followed was crushing, broken only by Obi-Wan's gasps as he scrambled to his master's side, cradling Qui-Gon's head as life ebbed from him. In that final moment, Qui-Gon's voice was soft, burdened with urgency. He asked Obi-Wan to train the boy they had discovered, Anakin Skywalker, the child he believed to be the chosen one, and though Obi-Wan's heart shattered with grief, he swore to honor his master's dying wish. When Qui-Gon's eyes closed for the last time, Obi-Wan was left kneeling in the hangar, a Padawan no longer but not yet ready to bear the title of knight, his triumph hollow, his soul scarred by the cost of victory. In the days that followed, as the Gungan and Naboo forces celebrated their unlikely alliance, Obi-Wan stood apart, mourning quietly, carrying within him the weight of both his master's death and the Council's charge. For the Jedi recognized his valor and granted him knighthood, acknowledging that through fire he had proven himself ready. But for Obi-Wan, the title was no comfort. It was only a reminder of the emptiness where Qui-Gon should have been. He accepted Anakin as his Padawan, not from eagerness but from duty, bound by the promise he had made, uncertain of his ability to guide the boy, but unwilling to let Qui-Gon's last wish go unfulfilled. Thus, the Battle of Naboo became more than a victory in the annals of the Republic. It was the crucible that transformed Obi-Wan from student to knight, from follower to leader, and from one life into another, burdened forever with both triumph and tragedy, and with the knowledge that destiny, once it reveals itself, never releases its hold. The echoes of the duel on Naboo lingered long after the battle had ended, shaping not only the course of the Republic, but the heart of Obi Wan Kenobi himself. For while the celebrations of victory filled the streets with music and light, Obi-Wan stood at their edges, his soul still heavy with the images of his master's fall. The sting of helplessness seared into his memory. He replayed the moment endlessly in his mind, the blinding red blade plunging into Qui-Gon, the barrier that had held him back, the rage that had driven his counterattack, and the fragile calm that had carried him to victory. And though the galaxy hailed him as the one who had defeated a Sith after 1,000 years, Obi-Wan carried no triumph in his heart, only the hollow ache of duty fulfilled at the highest cost. In the days that followed, the Jedi Council convened in somber reflection, debating not only the return of the Sith, but the fate of the boy Qui-Gon had believed to be the chosen one. And Obi-Wan stood before them, no longer Padawan but knight, his voice steady as he pledged to honor his master's dying wish by training Anakin Skywalker. Yet beneath his composure lay doubt as sharp as any blade, for he had not yet completed his own mourning, nor did he truly believe himself ready to bear the responsibility of guiding a child whose potential rivaled legends. Still, he bowed to the Council's decision, and with quiet resolve, he accepted Anakin as his Padawan, seeing in the boy not only Qui-Gon's dream, but the embodiment of the promise he had made as he held his master's fading body in his arms. The funeral pyre burned brightly against the night sky of Theed, flames dancing as Qui-Gon's form returned to the Force, and Obi-Wan stood beside young Anakin, who watched with wide, uncomprehending eyes the child's small hand clutched around the new life thrust upon him, while Obi-Wan, face stoic, felt the weight of two destinies pressing down upon his shoulders at once, the destiny of his own knighthood and the destiny of the boy he had sworn to guide. Beyond the personal loss, the Battle of Naboo carried with it whispers of something far greater. For the revelation of Darth Maul's existence shattered the complacency of the Order, forcing them to confront the truth that their ancient enemies had returned, hiding in the shadows, weaving plots that had already infiltrated the highest levels of power. Obi-Wan, though young, sensed the gravity of this revelation, his grief interwoven with unease. For if the Sith had endured in secrecy for centuries, what other truths had the Jedi failed to perceive? And yet, despite his doubts, he anchored himself in the only way he knew how, by embracing duty, by standing firm in the role now entrusted to him, by placing the needs of the Order and the galaxy above his own sorrow. As the Naboo people and the Gungans celebrated their alliance, as Padme Amidala reclaimed her throne with courage and grace, Obi-Wan lingered quietly at the edges of the festivities, his eyes often straying to Anakin, who played with mechanical parts or spoke eagerly with the Queen, oblivious to the enormity of what awaited him. And in these moments, Obi-Wan felt not only the promise of the future, but also the heavy uncertainty of how he, still so young and untested, could possibly provide the guidance this child required. Yet even in his uncertainty, he remembered Qui-Gon's words, remembered the warmth of his voice, and the unwavering faith he had held in Anakin. And so Obi-Wan vowed to find within himself the same belief, to honor his master by shaping the boy's future as best he could. In truth, the Battle of Naboo was less a victory and more a threshold. The moment Obi-Wan stepped out from behind Qui-Gon's shadow and into a light that was at once blinding and isolating, a moment that would define the rest of his life. For every choice that followed, every mission, every teaching, every loss would trace back to that hangar floor, to the duel where he had gained the mantle of knight and lost the man who had been his anchor. The memory of the crackling energy barriers, of the heat of the plasma, of the scream caught in his throat as Qui-Gon fell, would never leave him, a scar invisible yet deeper than any wound. And though he would go on to embody calm and wisdom to those who knew him, inside he carried always that reminder that destiny demands a price, and that the price is often paid in those we love. Obi-Wan Kenobi's life as a Jedi Knight began not with celebration of his own achievements, but with the solemn promise to raise a boy who was never meant to be his responsibility. For in honoring Qui-Gon Jinn's dying wish, he became master to Anakin Skywalker. The child prophesied to bring balance to the Force, and from the very beginning their relationship was marked by a strange duality, an unbreakable bond of loyalty and affection intertwined with tension, doubt, and the looming shadow of destiny. When Anakin was brought to the temple, Obi-Wan felt the strain of stepping into his new role too soon, still grieving for Qui-Gon and still uncertain of his own worthiness. Yet he held himself with outward composure, instructing the boy with patience even as he wrestled inwardly with doubts. He was determined to succeed not for his own sake, but because Qui-Gon had believed in Anakin so fiercely, and to fail would feel like failing his master all over again. At first, Anakin bristled against the strictness of his new mentor, for Obi-Wan was by nature cautious, reserved, and precise, while Anakin carried the boundless energy and recklessness of youth, his instincts raw and his talents blindingly apparent. And though Obi-Wan tried to temper him with discipline, their differences often sparked friction, with Obi-Wan chastising him for impatience and Anakin growing frustrated at being restrained. Yet beneath these struggles grew something deeper. Obi-Wan began to see Anakin not only as his Padawan, but as a brother, even a son, someone he was bound to protect and guide no matter the cost. And Anakin, despite his complaints, looked up to Obi-Wan as the closest thing he had to family, his trust running so deep that even when he disobeyed, he did so in the hope of proving himself worthy of his master's respect. Their missions together were as much lessons for Obi-Wan as they were for Anakin, from negotiating tense disputes on border worlds where Obi-Wan's calm reasoning balanced Anakin's fiery impulses, to battles where Obi-Wan's strategic mind complemented Anakin's raw courage. And over the years, the galaxy began to speak of them as an inseparable pair, the steady knight and the daring Padawan. Yet in quiet moments, Obi-Wan sometimes feared he could not truly give Anakin what he needed, for the boy's attachment to his mother, his hunger for belonging, and his unrestrained emotions were unlike anything Obi-Wan had encountered. And while he corrected and cautioned, he often wondered if Qui-Gon, with his gift for following the living force, might have guided Anakin with a gentler hand. Still, Obi-Wan persevered, teaching Anakin the ways of the saber with rigorous care, drilling him endlessly in forms until his skill rivaled any knight, lecturing him on the importance of patience and humility, trying with every word and gesture to mold him into the Jedi the Order needed him to be. And though their bond was imperfect, it was strong, forged through battles, shared danger, and the countless hours spent aboard starships moving from one mission to the next. Over time, Obi-Wan grew into his role as master, his own youthful uncertainties hardening into wisdom, his voice gaining the authority of experience. Yet he never lost the quiet affection he felt for Anakin, an affection that sometimes softened his discipline. For though he scolded the boy often, his reprimands were laced with care, his disappointment born not of anger but of fear that Anakin's recklessness might one day destroy him. Their relationship became a paradox, master and student, father and son, brothers in arms. And though Obi-Wan could sense that Anakin's path was fraught with peril, he chose to believe in him, to see not the flaws but the potential, to hold on to the hope that with enough guidance, enough love masked beneath stern words, the boy could fulfill the prophecy and bring balance to a galaxy that so desperately needed it. And so, in those early years, before the Clone Wars would thrust them both into legend, Obi-Wan's life as a master was defined by this bond, complex, challenging, and at times heartbreaking, yet unshakable in its devotion, an echo of Qui-Gon's faith passed down, imperfect, yet enduring, binding Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker together in a partnership that would shape the fate of the galaxy. The years that followed Obi-Wan Kenobi's knighting were shaped almost entirely by his role as teacher, protector, and surrogate family to Anakin Skywalker. And though history would often paint their partnership as seamless, the truth was far more complex, for it was in those years that the first cracks in Anakin's destiny began to show, and that Obi-Wan's struggle to balance discipline with compassion was tested again and again. From their earliest missions together, the contrast between them was stark. Obi-Wan, cautious and methodical, weighing options carefully before acting, and Anakin, impulsive, daring, and often unwilling to wait when his instincts urged him forward. And while this difference made them formidable as a pair, complementing one another in the field, it also led to countless arguments, Obi-Wan scolding his Padawan for recklessness even as he secretly admired the brilliance of Anakin's instincts. On worlds racked by political unrest, Obi-Wan played the diplomat, smoothing tensions with calm words, while Anakin simmered with impatience, eager to act. Yet, when danger finally erupted, it was often Anakin who saved the day with bold strokes that left Obi-Wan torn between pride and exasperation. In training halls, Obi-Wan was exacting, drilling Anakin endlessly in lightsaber forms and force exercises, believing that mastery of discipline could curb his Padawan's volatility. But Anakin, though obedient for stretches, always found ways to bend the rules, sneaking into workshops to tinker with machines or attempting advanced maneuvers far before he was ready. Still, Obi-Wan persisted, balancing stern lectures with encouragement, never letting Anakin doubt that he was valued, even when he seemed to disapprove. Yet beneath this rhythm of growth and challenge lay deeper currents, for Obi-Wan often sensed the boy's fear of loss, of inadequacy, of the attachments he still carried. And though he tried to guide him toward letting go, toward embracing the Jedi Code's path of serenity, he could never quite erase those shadows, nor could he help but wonder whether Qui-Gon might have managed what he could not. Their bond, however, grew ever stronger, shaped by shared trials and the countless times they relied upon one another to survive. On Raxus, where a simple negotiation spiraled into an ambush, Obi-Wan's calm deflection of blaster fire held their enemies at bay long enough for Anakin to free a group of captives. And afterward, though Obi-Wan scolded him for charging ahead, he could not hide his smile at the boy's bravery. On Vancor, when Anakin nearly fell from a cliff in the heat of battle, Obi-Wan's outstretched hand caught him, and the look of gratitude in the Padawan's eyes reminded Obi-Wan that no matter how strained their disagreements, their trust in one another was absolute. The Council, watching closely, sometimes questioned Obi-Wan's methods, wondering if his rigid adherence to rules only deepened Anakin's resistance. But they could not deny the progress the boy made under his care, nor the bond that had formed, a bond so deep it often resembled family more than formality. In quiet moments aboard their ship as stars streaked by, Obi-Wan sometimes softened, sharing stories of Qui-Gon, of the lessons he himself had struggled with, reminding Anakin that being a Jedi was not about perfection, but about persistence. And in those moments, Anakin listened with uncharacteristic quiet, his admiration for his master plain, though unspoken. For Obi-Wan, these years were as much a test of his own growth as of Anakin's, for he learned to balance his natural caution with the need to trust his Padawan's instincts, to bend his own rigidity just enough to allow Anakin's brilliance to shine. And though he worried constantly about the dangers of attachment and pride, he also came to love Anakin as a brother, even a son, his loyalty to the boy becoming as defining as his loyalty to the Order itself. And yet, hidden within that love was the seed of tragedy, for though Obi-Wan gave all he could, discipline, guidance, affection wrapped in sternness, there were shadows he could not dispel and attachments he could not sever. And as he walked beside Anakin in those formative years, shaping him with every word and action, he could never have imagined that the very bond that made them inseparable would one day shatter in flames, leaving scars that would mark them both forever. When the Clone Wars erupted across the galaxy, Obi Wan Kenobi, once a cautious knight and reluctant teacher, was thrust into a role he had never sought but could not refuse, that of a general leading legions of soldiers into battle, his blue lightsaber now not only a symbol of the Jedi's ancient guardianship, but also the command rod of a vast military machine that bore the weight of the Republic's survival. And in this crucible, Obi-Wan's character was tested more than ever before. For though his heart longed for peace, he adapted with unwavering resolve to the endless campaigns that consumed the stars. Clad in white clone armor over his Jedi robes, he became the embodiment of calm under fire, a commander whose strategy was marked not by reckless charges, but by patience, foresight, and a remarkable ability to inspire loyalty in those who followed him, and none more so than the clone troopers of the 212th Attack Battalion, who came to trust him as deeply as any Jedi could be trusted. From the sieges of Christophsis and Umbra to the desperate defenses of Ryloth and Mandalore, Obi-Wan fought not as a conqueror, but as a guardian, always seeking to minimize loss of life, always remembering that even in war, compassion was a Jedi's truest weapon. His bond with Anakin deepened in these years, the two serving together as generals in campaign after campaign, their contrasting styles blending into an almost perfect harmony. Obi-Wan steady, deliberate, the shield; Anakin bold, impulsive, the sword, and together they won victories that kept the Republic alive in its darkest hours, earning them a reputation as heroes of the Republic. Yet the Clone Wars were not only battles of armies, but of the soul, for with each victory came the gnawing realization that the Jedi were becoming something they had never been meant to be: soldiers, enforcers of a political order, drifting further from the peacekeepers they were sworn to be. And Obi-Wan, though loyal to the Council, could not help but feel the disquiet, especially as the war dragged on without end, manipulated by forces he could sense but not yet name. On the front lines, he faced enemies who would haunt him: the cunning General Grievous, whose cybernetic body and lightsaber collection tested Obi-Wan's patience and resolve in countless duels, and the wily Count Dooku, once a Jedi himself, who taunted Obi-Wan with truths about corruption and deception that Obi-Wan could not entirely dismiss. But it was not only great adversaries who marked these years. It was the bonds he formed with soldiers like Commander Cody, whose loyalty and friendship reminded him daily that the clones, bred for war, were living beings with individuality, humor, and courage, not mere tools of the Republic's will. Many nights aboard the Negotiator, his starship, Obi-Wan would walk the corridors in silence, pausing to watch troopers at rest and wonder how the Order had come to accept a war fought on the backs of men bred for battle. And though he hid his doubts behind a mask of serenity, they weighed heavily on him, for Obi-Wan was no fool, and he sensed that the Jedi were being drawn into a trap from which there was no easy escape. And yet, despite his doubts, he never wavered in his duty. He stood on the ramparts of worlds under siege, his voice steady as he rallied soldiers who would have followed him into fire, and he became known across the galaxy as a general who could be trusted, a leader whose courage was matched only by his compassion. His legend grew in these years. The Negotiator. Some called him for his skill in diplomacy, though others knew him as the unflinching defender who held lines that seemed impossible to hold. And always at his side was Anakin, whose bond with him became as close as brothers, their banter on the battlefield a mask for the profound trust they shared. Yet beneath it all lay the shadow of the Sith, orchestrating the war from behind the scenes, and Obi-Wan, though he fought with all his heart, could not shake the sense that each battle was but a piece in a larger game, one whose outcome he could not yet see. The Clone Wars made him a hero, but they also eroded the very foundation of the Jedi, turning peacekeepers into warriors, blurring the line between justice and survival. And for Obi-Wan, who had always defined himself by service, it was a trial of faith as much as of arms. Still he endured, carrying himself with dignity, never allowing despair to overtake him. Even when surrounded by destruction, for he knew that if he faltered, so too would those who looked to him for hope. And so, through the fire and storm of the Clone Wars, Obi Wan Kenobi became not only a general of armies, but a general of hearts, a figure whose steady light guided soldiers, Padawans, and allies alike through the chaos of a galaxy at war, even as destiny crept ever closer, preparing to test him in ways more devastating than any battlefield could. As the Clone Wars dragged into its second and third years, Obi Wan Kenobi's legend as a general grew, not because he sought glory, but because again and again he proved himself the embodiment of calm courage. A figure who stood unshaken even when the galaxy seemed to spin into chaos, and his campaigns became the stuff of stories whispered among clones and civilians alike. On Christophsis, he held the line against separatist armies with nothing but strategy and the discipline of his troops, his patience allowing Anakin to unleash his bold strikes at just the right moment. Their victory there cementing them as the Republic's champions in the eyes of many. On Ryloth, Obi-Wan's compassion was tested as he coordinated the liberation of Twi'lek villages caught between occupation and bombardment, his voice steady as he reassured frightened civilians while still directing soldiers in battle, showing that even in the heart of war, he never forgot the Jedi's first duty, to protect the innocent. On Umbara, he clashed with the harsh methods of General Krell, his heart heavy as he watched clones forced into suicidal assaults. And though he obeyed orders as the Council demanded, the disquiet within him deepened, his mind wrestling with the terrible realization that the Jedi, by fighting this war, had allowed themselves to become part of a machine that crushed lives without mercy. Yet his own leadership was always marked by humanity. His bond with Commander Cody and the 212th, a shining example of respect between Jedi and clones. For Obi-Wan saw them not as property of the Republic, but as brothers, unique souls whose individuality deserved acknowledgement. He would sit with them around campfires between battles, listen to their banter, and even smile at their jokes, forging a loyalty that made his battalion fight all the harder for him. Time and again, Obi-Wan faced his great nemeses, Count Dooku, whose mastery of the dark side and bitter words about the corruption of the Republic cut deeper than saber strikes, and General Grievous, whose monstrous body and collection of lightsabers from fallen Jedi made him a terrifying adversary. Their duels were like storms, Grievous's whirling blades against Obi-Wan's calm precision. And though Obi-Wan often retreated or fought only to survive, he carried with him the unshaken knowledge that one day it would fall to him to end the monster's reign. On Mandalore, destiny twisted the knife deeper when he once again crossed paths with Duchess Satine Kryze, the woman he had once loved. And in her presence, the calm mask of the Jedi faltered, revealing the man beneath who had once wished to abandon the Order for her. Though they had chosen their separate paths, he to the Jedi, she to pacifist leadership, their bond remained, and when Satine was later slain before his eyes by Maul, Obi-Wan carried yet another scar into the depths of his soul, his grief hidden but never forgotten. The war was a crucible, and it shaped Obi-Wan into the man history remembers, endlessly patient, yet capable of decisive ferocity, deeply compassionate, yet hardened by loss. A warrior who never forgot that peace was the goal, even when it seemed forever out of reach. He became known across the galaxy as the Negotiator, but those who followed him knew he was more than a diplomat. He was a commander whose very presence on the battlefield was a beacon, his steady hand guiding them through fire and chaos. Yet even as his victories mounted, so too did his doubts, for the Jedi Council, increasingly mired in politics and secrecy, seemed blind to the trap that was closing around them, and Obi-Wan, though loyal to the end, could not banish the sense that the very war he fought was a shadow play orchestrated by an enemy unseen. Still, he pressed on, because to falter was to abandon not only the Republic, but also the countless soldiers and civilians who depended on him. And if Obi-Wan Kenobi's legacy in the Clone Wars can be reduced to one truth, it is this: that he carried the burden of being both warrior and protector without letting the fire of war consume the light within him, a light that shone not only for his soldiers and allies, but for Anakin, whose bond with him, tested in every campaign, grew stronger even as destiny drew them toward the tragedy that neither could yet see. Among the many trials that tested Obi-Wan Kenobi during the Clone Wars, few left as deep an impression as his encounters with Count Dooku and General Grievous, adversaries who embodied two different faces of the same dark war. One, the fallen Jedi, whose elegance and rhetoric challenged the very soul of the Order. The other, the monstrous warlord, whose body was forged for nothing but destruction. And in these duels, Obi-Wan's calm endurance was tested against forces that sought not only his death, but the unraveling of everything he believed in. With Dooku, the battles were as much of words as of blades, for the Count, once the wise Jedi Master who had trained Qui-Gon Jinn, fought with a grace that mirrored his aristocratic bearing, wielding Form 2 Makashi with precision so refined that it seemed to mock the raw power of his opponents. When Obi-Wan faced him, whether on Geonosis, Coruscant, or in skirmishes across the galaxy, he felt not only the weight of the Count's mastery, but also the sting of his taunts. For Dooku knew well that Qui-Gon's teachings lived on in his former Padawan, and he wielded this knowledge like a dagger, reminding Obi-Wan of the failures of the Council, of the hypocrisy of leading soldiers in a war they had never been meant to fight. And though Obi-Wan refuted him with calm words, part of him could not help but feel the truth behind the venom. Their lightsabers clashed in showers of sparks, Dooku's elegant thrusts testing Obi-Wan's mastery of Soresu, the defensive form he had perfected. And though time and again Obi-Wan held firm, it was clear that the Count did not seek to destroy him outright, but to unbalance him, to tempt him into doubt, for he knew that if Obi-Wan faltered, the Republic's defense would weaken, and the war would tilt further into the Separatists' favor. Yet, for all his skill and composure, Obi-Wan was often overwhelmed by Dooku's sheer power in the Force. Hurled aside by lightning or crushed beneath telekinetic blows, his resilience tested to its limit, and though he endured, each encounter left him bruised, not only in body, but in spirit. A reminder that even the most disciplined Jedi could be brought low by the corruption of one who had once stood among their highest. In contrast, Grievous was no fallen philosopher but a beast of war, a living weapon who relished destruction, his coughing breath echoing through the corridors of starships and the smoke of battlefields. Their duels were brutal, Grievous's 4 arms spinning sabers in dizzying storms that forced Obi-Wan to retreat into the pure core of Soresu. His calm defense, the only answer to the monster's relentless offense. Where Anakin might have met Grievous with raw aggression, Obi-Wan weathered the storm, parrying 100 strikes with patience until the general's overconfidence opened a flaw. And in these moments, the difference between them became clear. Grievous fought to overwhelm, Obi-Wan to endure, and in endurance, there was victory. Their final battle on Utapau was a clash of legends. Obi-Wan leaping down into the sinkhole city to confront the cyborg warlord before armies, his voice steady as he declared Grievous's defeat even before the first strike. And though the duel carried him through catwalks, hangars, and the back of a roaring varactyl, Obi-Wan never wavered, using precision and calm to whittle down the monster until, with a single desperate shot from a blaster, he ended the terror once and for all. Yet even that victory was bittersweet, for in killing Grievous, Obi-Wan did not end the war, only played further into the designs of the hidden Sith Lord who had orchestrated every step. These duels with Dooku and Grievous were more than battles of flesh and steel. They were mirrors of the war itself, one showing the seduction of corruption dressed in elegance, the other the horror of violence stripped of all humanity, and in facing them, Obi-Wan's own soul was tempered, his resolve hardened, and his awareness of the greater darkness deepened. He emerged from these trials not untouched, for he carried with him the weight of each clash, the sting of defeat and the hollow taste of victory. But through it all, he held to the core of who he was, a Jedi who, no matter the storm, would remain the calm within it, the shield that endured when all others fell. For Obi Wan Kenobi, the duels with Count Dooku and General Grievous were not isolated battles, but recurring trials that defined the middle years of the Clone Wars and revealed to him, more than anything else, the shape of the darkness encroaching on the galaxy. For each adversary represented a different truth about the conflict. The Count a reminder that even Jedi could fall into corruption cloaked in reason, and Grievous proof that war could twist flesh and spirit into something unrecognizable, driven only by hatred and destruction. And in facing them again and again, Obi-Wan's resolve was tested in ways that words in the council chambers never could. Against Dooku, every clash was a duel of philosophies as much as blades. Dooku's mastery of Makashi was elegant and relentless, his blade weaving arcs of precise thrusts designed to pierce the defenses of any who opposed him. And though Obi-Wan Soresu was among the most refined in the Order, he found himself repeatedly pressed, his calm shield straining beneath the Count's skill. Time and again, Obi-Wan would hear the venom of Dooku's taunts, that the Jedi were no longer peacekeepers, that they had become generals enslaved to the Senate, that their blindness to corruption would doom them. And though Obi-Wan never allowed these words to shatter his focus in the moment, he could not help but carry them into the quiet after, wondering, if only for a breath, whether there was truth in the accusations. Yet Obi-Wan's strength was not in overwhelming power, but in his ability to endure, and so he met Dooku's blade with the unyielding patience of a mountain, parrying, redirecting, surviving, until circumstance forced the Count's retreat, or Anakin's fiery aggression pushed their enemy back. And though Dooku often escaped, Obi-Wan knew that each clash was teaching him something more vital than victory. It was teaching him the necessity of humility in the face of brilliance turned to darkness. Grievous, by contrast, was not elegant but monstrous, his mechanical body carrying 4 spinning sabers at once, his strikes so fast they blurred into a storm of green and blue. And where another Jedi might have faltered, Obi-Wan anchored himself in the core of Soresu, parrying each blow with calm precision, allowing Grievous's fury to exhaust itself against the shield of his discipline. Their encounters were terrifying storms of violence, Grievous's coughing breath punctuating the chaos as Obi-Wan shifted, rolled, and countered, waiting for the slimmest opening, for the moment when the general's arrogance or mechanical excess created the flaw he could exploit. On Utapau, their final duel became the culmination of all that Obi-Wan had learned. For there, in the cavernous sinkhole city, he leapt into the midst of battle with the calm certainty of one who knew he was the galaxy's last shield against a monster of war. And though the clash carried him across catwalks, through droid legions, and onto the back of the mighty Varactyl Boga, Obi-Wan never wavered, meeting the storm with unshakable patience until, disarmed and desperate, Grievous's organic heart was exposed. And Obi-Wan, with no other choice, fired a blaster into the monster's chest, ending the terror once and for all. Yet even in victory, Obi-Wan felt no triumph, for he knew that slaying Grievous did not end the war, but only deepened the trap into which the Jedi had been lured. And he felt, as he stood on the battlefield with the smoke rising around him, the same bitter hollowness that had followed the duel on Naboo years before. These two enemies, so different yet united in their opposition to the Jedi, were reflections of the galaxy itself, one a fallen idealist, the other a weapon stripped of all humanity. And in facing them, Obi-Wan learned that victory in war was never pure, never clean, but always tainted by the cost of what was lost along the way. And though he carried the scars of those duels, he also carried forward the lesson that defined him more than any single battle, that the true strength of a Jedi was not in overwhelming power or spectacular triumph, but in the ability to stand firm, to endure, and to protect, no matter the storm that raged before him. The fall of Anakin Skywalker was the greatest wound Obi Wan Kenobi would ever endure, a slow unraveling that he had sensed but could never fully prevent, a tragedy that began long before the flames of Mustafar and unfolded in quiet shadows between battles, in whispered temptations, and in the aching spaces where fear and love twisted into something darker. For Anakin, the boy who had once looked at Obi-Wan with unshakable loyalty, was already walking a path that pulled him further from the Jedi, even as the war demanded their bond grow closer. Obi-Wan had watched the signs, the restlessness in his Padawan's eyes when the Council restrained him, the flashes of anger that flared in duels when patience would have sufficed, the attachments he clung to despite every lesson about letting go. And though Obi-Wan counseled him gently, urging caution, urging serenity, he also trusted him, loved him, and believed, perhaps too much, that the strength of their brotherhood would anchor Anakin against any storm. Yet as the Clone Wars drew to their terrible climax, the currents of fate moved swiftly, and Palpatine, whose kindly guidance Anakin revered, revealed himself as more than a mentor, but as the Sith Lord Darth Sidious, offering Anakin what he feared the Jedi could not: power to protect those he loved, power to forestall the death he foresaw in visions of Padme. And though Obi-Wan suspected something dark in the Chancellor's grip on his former apprentice, he did not know until too late the depth of the manipulation. When the Council asked Obi-Wan to keep watch on Anakin, to test his loyalty by reporting on the Chancellor, Obi-Wan felt the bitter fracture in their bond widen. For Anakin, already torn between loyalty to his master and devotion to Palpatine, felt betrayed. And Obi-Wan, though loyal to the Council, hated himself for the role he was forced to play, whispering in private to Anakin that he was proud of him, that he had become a greater Jedi than he himself could ever hope to be, words spoken with truth and love, but too late to erase the seeds already sown. The breaking point came swiftly. Anakin, consumed by fear of losing Padme, turned not to the Order, but to the Sith, kneeling before Sidious in desperation, and in that act the bond he shared with Obi-Wan was shattered, replaced by a new allegiance to a master who promised certainty rather than wisdom, power rather than patience. When Obi-Wan learned the truth, It was as if the galaxy itself had collapsed, for the boy he had raised, fought beside, laughed with, and loved as a brother had become Darth Vader, a Sith who hunted Jedi across Coruscant's burning skies. And still Obi-Wan could scarcely bring himself to believe it until the Council dispatched him to confront Anakin on Mustafar. There, amid rivers of fire and skies of smoke, master and student faced each other, their words heavy with grief and accusation, Obi-Wan pleading with Anakin to turn back, Anakin declaring that Obi-Wan's betrayal had forced his hand, that the Jedi were weak and corrupt, that only through Sidious could he save Padme and reshape the galaxy, and in their clashing voices was all the pain of years of love turned to ruin. Their duel was fierce, one of the greatest in Jedi history, not merely a battle of skill, but of souls torn apart, their blades sparking against each other in a frenzy of familiarity, each knowing the other's style as intimately as his own, each countering instinctively as if fighting a reflection. They moved across bridges and platforms, through chambers and across the very rivers of lava, neither yielding, both driven by conviction and heartbreak, until at last Obi-Wan, with tears in his eyes, found the high ground and warned Anakin that to continue would be his doom. But Anakin, blinded by arrogance and desperation, leapt, and Obi-Wan's blade struck, severing his limbs and sending him crashing to the bank below, where the heat of the molten river licked at his broken body. Obi-Wan's heart tore as he stood above him, hearing his former apprentice's screams of hatred, seeing in his eyes not the boy he had raised, but the monster Sidious had forged, and yet still he could not finish him. He turned away, leaving Anakin to the fire, his voice breaking as he declared that Anakin was the chosen one, meant to destroy the Sith, not join them, his tears falling into the ash. It was the greatest failure of his life, a wound that would never fully heal. For though he had defeated the Sith Lord's new apprentice, he had lost his brother, his son, his dearest companion. And in that loss, the galaxy itself seemed to dim. For the Republic had fallen, the Jedi were being hunted, and Obi Wan Kenobi, who had once believed in hope, now walked into exile with only grief as his companion, haunted forever by the knowledge that love had not been enough to save Anakin Skywalker from the fall. The tragedy of Anakin's fall did not end on the fiery banks of Mustafar, for though Obi Wan Kenobi had left his former apprentice broken, consumed by fire and hatred, the wound in his own heart only deepened as he learned piece by piece what had become of the boy he had once called brother, and the enormity of what Anakin's betrayal meant for the galaxy. In the aftermath of the duel, when he carried Padme Amidala away from that hellish world, Obi-Wan saw in her fading eyes the cost of Anakin's choices. For though she tried to cling to life long enough to bring Luke and Leia into the world, her body could not endure the sorrow. And with her last breaths, she whispered of the good that still lived within Anakin, words that haunted Obi-Wan. For he could not reconcile the man who had slaughtered younglings in the temple, who had knelt before Sidious, who had turned his blade against his own master, with the boy Padme still believed in. As the Republic transformed overnight into the Empire, as Palpatine declared himself Emperor and painted the Jedi as traitors, Obi-Wan went into hiding, his every step heavy with the burden of failure, his every breath a reminder that his dearest friend had become the very monster they had sworn to destroy. Yet news traveled even into the shadows, and Obi-Wan heard whispers of the Emperor's new enforcer, a dark figure clad in black armor whose mechanical breaths echoed across battlefields, whose crimson blades struck fear into the hearts of all who opposed the new regime. And in those whispers, Obi-Wan recognized the truth. Anakin had not perished on Mustafar, but had been remade, reborn as Darth Vader, a creature more machine than man. And the realization broke him anew, for in leaving his brother to the flames, he had not ended his torment, but condemned him to a fate even crueler. Night after night, Obi-Wan wrestled with memories of the boy he had trained. The laughter in the temple halls, the fierce loyalty on campaign, the moments of brotherly banter during the Clone Wars, and each memory cut against the reality that this same boy now hunted Jedi across the stars, extinguishing the very order that had raised them both. To the galaxy, Darth Vader was a terror. To Obi-Wan, he was a living ghost, a reminder of everything he had failed to prevent, and the knowledge weighed so heavily upon him that even in exile he found no peace. For though he hid from the Empire's gaze, he could never hide from the ache in his soul. What made the fall unbearable was not only the betrayal, but the love that remained. For Obi-Wan could not erase his affection for Anakin, could not cast away the bond that had defined his life, and so his grief was not the cold detachment of a soldier mourning a fallen comrade, but the raw, unending sorrow of a father losing his son, of a brother losing his twin, of a man forced to watch hope itself turn to ash. And still, in the quiet of night on Tatooine, beneath the endless desert stars, he would sometimes close his eyes and hear Padme's final words, her insistence that there was good in Anakin yet. And though reason told him it was impossible, though his own heart told him that Darth Vader had consumed every trace of the boy he loved, still a sliver of doubt remained. A fragile thread of hope buried beneath all the sorrow, and it was that fragile hope that would one day bring him face to face with destiny once again. When the Jedi Order crumbled and the Republic was reshaped into the Empire, Obi Wan Kenobi vanished into the silence of the Outer Rim, carrying with him not only the grief of losing his brother Anakin to the darkness, but also the sacred responsibility of protecting the future in the form of Anakin's son, Luke Skywalker. And so he chose Tatooine, a harsh, barren desert world scorched by twin suns and haunted by the memories of Anakin's childhood, as the place of his exile, a world so remote that the Empire paid it little heed, yet close enough for Obi-Wan to keep watch over the boy from the shadows. The years that followed were a test unlike any battle he had ever fought, for on the battlefield he had relied upon discipline, training, and the unity of comrades. But in exile, he relied only upon patience, solitude, and the quiet voice of the Force, whispering through endless dunes. Each day he rose with the suns, the sand stretching endlessly around him, the horizon shimmering with heat, and though his hut was meager and his life reduced to the simplest of routines, his thoughts were never free of the burdens he carried. The memory of Qui-Gon's death, the loss of Satine, the slaughter of the Jedi, and the haunting image of Anakin burning on the banks of Mustafar. To the people of Tatooine, he was Ben Kenobi, a strange hermit who kept to himself, wandering the Jundland wastes, helping when he could but never revealing his true nature. And though he longed for companionship, he held himself apart, knowing that attachment and recognition could bring doom to both him and the boy he protected. Yet Obi-Wan was never idle, for his exile was not abandonment, but vigilance. From afar he watched Luke grow on the Lars homestead under the care of Owen and Beru, his heart aching with pride and sorrow as he saw the boy's spirit shine, so much like his father's, yet tempered with a gentleness that gave him hope that perhaps this Skywalker might walk a different path. At night, when the desert winds howled across the sands and the stars stretched endlessly above, Obi-Wan would sit in meditation, reaching for the Force not as a warrior, but as a seeker, listening for guidance, seeking communion with the living Force and with Qui-Gon, whose teachings he hoped might one day return to him through the veil of the cosmic plane. There were dangers, of course, Tusken raiders who prowled the wastes, petty criminals and smugglers who haunted Mos Eisley's cantina, and even bounty hunters who passed through in search of prey. But Obi-Wan's blade stayed mostly hidden, drawn only in moments when there was no other choice, for he knew that the survival of Luke depended upon his secrecy, upon remaining a shadow rather than a hero. And so the years stretched into decades, each one marked not by glory, but by endurance. Obi-Wan carrying the heavy silence of a man who had once been at the heart of history and was now reduced to watching from afar, his spirit weary yet sustained by the faint flame of hope that one day the boy would rise and restore what had been lost. In his solitude, Obi-Wan reflected deeply on his failures and his choices, and though he could never forgive himself fully for Anakin's fall, he sought peace in the knowledge that Luke represented a chance for redemption, not only for the galaxy but for his own heart, a chance to believe that all the pain he had endured was not in vain. The desert became both his prison and his sanctuary, a place where he could hide from the Empire's gaze, yet also confront the truth he had long buried. And though the days were harsh and the nights cold, Obi-Wan endured, as he always had, finding in the simple rhythms of survival a strange form of clarity. He grew older, his beard whitening, his eyes carrying the weight of sorrow and wisdom, and the galaxy largely forgot his name. But within him the light of the Jedi still burned, quiet and steady, waiting for the day when it would be called upon once more, when the boy he watched from the distance would step into destiny, and Obi-Wan would once again step from shadow into legend. The years of Obi Wan Kenobi's exile on Tatooine stretched on like the desert itself, endless, monotonous, and unyielding. Yet within that barren silence lay the most profound test of his spirit. For unlike the fierce duels of his youth, or the chaos of the Clone Wars, this was a battle fought against loneliness, regret, and the crushing weight of memory, and in many ways it was the hardest of all. By day, he lived as Ben, the reclusive hermit whom locals regarded with suspicion, wandering the markets of Anchorhead on rare occasions, or trading in Mos Eisley when necessity forced him into contact, his hood drawn low, his voice kept soft, every word and gesture designed to conceal the truth of who he was, while by night he returned to his hut, its modest walls holding little more than essentials, robes, rations, a few tools, and the quiet hum of his lightsaber hidden away, a weapon he hoped never to wield again, yet kept close because he knew the galaxy was never without danger. He made a quiet ritual of watching the Lars homestead from afar, a solitary figure at the edge of the dunes, his heart swelling and aching as he saw Luke grow from an infant into a curious child, chasing womp rats across the fields, or staring at the twin suns with that same restless yearning his father had once carried. Obi-Wan often longed to draw near, to guide the boy openly, but he held himself back, knowing that his presence would endanger Luke and risk stirring memories Owen Lars had no wish to revisit. For Owen regarded him with distrust, seeing in Obi-Wan not a guardian, but the man who had delivered Anakin into ruin. And so Obi-Wan endured the sharp words and cold stares, accepting them as penance. For in truth, he believed Owen was right to be wary. Had he not failed as a master once, allowing Anakin to fall? And so perhaps the boy was better off with his uncle's stern protection than with the tutelage of a broken Jedi haunted by ghosts. Still, in the quiet moments of the night, when the desert winds whistled through the canyons and the stars glimmered like distant beacons, Obi-Wan reached out through the Force, whispering prayers of protection over the boy, and at times he thought he could hear whispers in return, faint echoes of Qui-Gon guiding him, reminding him that exile was not abandonment, but preparation, that patience was its own form of courage. Yet patience did not erase the burdens he carried. Dreams often tormented him with visions of Anakin's laughter turning to screams, of Satini's smile fading into darkness, of younglings crying out as blaster fire cut them down, and he would wake in a cold sweat, alone in the sand, his only companions the memories of those he could not save. And yet even in his despair, Obi-Wan found ways to hold on to purpose, rescuing a lost traveler from Tusken raiders and slipping away before thanks could be offered, subtly sabotaging smugglers who preyed on moisture farmers, using his skills quietly and anonymously to keep the balance of life on Tatooine just stable enough for Luke to grow up in safety. The desert became his teacher as much as the temple had once been, its vast silences teaching him humility, its harshness teaching him endurance, its beauty reminding him that even in barren places, life endured stubbornly, as he too must endure. Seasons passed, sands shifted, his hair whitened, and his beard thickened, and the galaxy moved on, the Empire tightening its grip, the Jedi all but extinct, yet through it all Obi-Wan remained. Steadfast and watchful, his light diminished but not extinguished, waiting for the day when destiny would stir again, and the boy he guarded from afar would step into the path the Force had laid before him. In exile, Obi Wan Kenobi became not the warrior of old but the silent sentinel, the guardian in shadow, the man who bore sorrow in silence so that hope, fragile though it was, might survive in the form of a child who would one day redeem not only the galaxy, but the memory of the brother he had lost. The hermit years of Obi-Wan. Kenobi were unlike anything that had come before in his life, for where once he had been a warrior standing at the heart of galactic conflict, now he lived as a shadow in the desert, a forgotten man known only as Ben to the sparse inhabitants of Tatooine. And this period of obscurity proved to be his greatest trial, for it demanded from him not the flash of heroics or the sharp edge of battle, but the endless patience of watchfulness, the humility to endure anonymity, and the strength to live with the ghosts of all he had lost. In these long years, Obi-Wan's days followed a rhythm as harsh and unyielding as the sands themselves, rising with the twin suns, fetching water from moisture vaporators, tending to the small repairs of his hut, trading sparingly in Anchorhead or Mos Eisley when supplies dwindled, always careful to avoid drawing attention, his hood pulled low, his words clipped, his very presence designed to blend into the background of a planet too rough to care about one more wanderer. Yet beneath that disguise burned the vigilance of a guardian, for though he lived apart, his true purpose never wavered: to watch over Luke Skywalker, the child of his fallen brother, to ensure the boy's safety and one day his awakening. And so often at dusk he would trek the dunes and position himself at a distance, observing the Lars homestead as Luke grew from infant to child, from child to boy, a spark of life running across the fields, climbing machinery, gazing at the stars with the same hunger that had once burned in Anakin's eyes. To watch Luke filled Obi-Wan with both hope and sorrow, for he saw in him echoes of the Father, bravery, restlessness, brilliance, but also something gentler, steadier. And it was this balance that gave him solace, a whisper from the Force that perhaps the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. Still, exile was a weight heavy on his soul, and in the long stretches of silence, Obi-Wan was left to wrestle with himself, to relive the failures that had driven him here, to hear in dreams the clash of sabers on Mustafar, to see again Anakin's burning body, to feel again Satine's hand slip from his grasp. And each memory struck him like a blade, carving into his spirit until the quiet of his hut became both refuge and prison. Yet he endured as he always had, seeking the discipline of meditation, reaching into the Force for guidance, listening for the faint voice of Qui-Gon across the veil of the living and cosmic Force, practicing the patience his master had always urged. And though the contact came only in fragments, echoes, glimpses, whispers, it was enough to keep him steady, enough to remind him that he was not truly alone. Occasionally, necessity drew him back into the lives of others, for danger on Tatooine was never far. Tusken raids threatened the farmers, slavers preyed on the vulnerable, and criminals ruled in Mos Eisley's cantina. And while Obi-Wan often held back, avoiding confrontation, there were moments when he could not stay idle, moments when a flash of his saber or the quiet push of the Force saved lives, though always he vanished afterward, leaving behind only rumors of a mysterious hermit. These small acts sustained him, reminding him that even in exile he was still a Jedi, still a servant of compassion, even if no one knew his name. Time etched itself upon his body, his hair grew white, his face lined with age, his shoulders bowed with sorrow, and the galaxy moved on, the Empire tightening its grip, the Jedi becoming myths whispered of only in secret. Yet still Obi-Wan remained, bound to the desert, bound to his vigil, bound to the hope that one day Luke would rise. And though his existence was lonely, even painful, it wasn't without meaning, for in the stillness of those hermit years, Obi Wan Kenobi was tempered not into the hero of legend, but into the quiet guardian of hope, a man who bore his suffering in silence so that the flame of the future might endure, waiting for the day when his exile would end and the Force would call him to step from shadow into light once more. The hermit years deepened into a long stretch of quiet survival and inner struggle, where Obi Wan Kenobi, once a general and Jedi Knight whose name was known across the Republic, became a man who lived in silence, fading into obscurity beneath Tatooine's unforgiving twin suns. And though to the people of Anchorhead and Mos Eisley he was just Ben, the odd-weathered wanderer who kept to himself, to Obi-Wan these years were a crucible that tested not only his endurance, but the very essence of what it meant to remain a Jedi in a galaxy that no longer believed they existed. Every day, he carried the paradox of being both guardian and ghost, watching over Luke Skywalker from afar, never stepping too close, yet never allowing danger to draw near the boy without his quiet intervention. Often he lingered at the edges of the Lars homestead, cloaked and unseen, watching Luke grow into a spirited child, daring and curious, his laughter drifting across the desert winds like an echo of Anakin's youth. And though the sight filled Obi-Wan with warmth, it also deepened his sorrow, for he could not look upon Luke without remembering the fire and ruin of Mustafar, without remembering Padme's dying breath, without feeling the weight of all that had been lost. But still he endured, for Luke represented more than a memory. He was hope itself, the one spark the galaxy still had, and Obi-Wan would give everything, even his life, to protect that spark. In those long years, Obi-Wan sought solace in routine, tending to his hut, rationing his supplies, venturing into Mos Eisley to trade when necessary, and vanishing again before anyone could ask too many questions, though rumors of his strange abilities and wandering habits began to circulate in hushed tones. Yet the greater part of his life was spent in meditation, kneeling in the shifting sands, listening to the voice of the Force as he had once listened in the quiet of the temple. And slowly, over time, he began to sense the faintest echoes of Qui-Gon Jinn, his beloved master, reaching to him through the veil of the cosmic force, guiding him toward patience, reminding him that even in exile, he had purpose. But exile was not a place free of danger. Tusken raiders prowled the wastes, violent skirmishes broke out among moisture farmers and smugglers, and criminals thrived in the lawless heat. And though Obi-Wan strove to remain hidden, there were moments when he could not turn away, moments when a villager was spared from a raiding party because of a sudden, inexplicable warning, or when a thief found himself disarmed by an unseen hand. And though Obi-Wan never lingered for gratitude, disappearing as swiftly as he had appeared, these secret acts of compassion sustained him, reminding him that he was still a Jedi, even if the galaxy no longer spoke their name. In the stillness of night, when he lay on his simple cot beneath the cool desert sky, Obi-Wan's mind often wandered to the past, replaying his greatest failures: Anakin's betrayal, Satine's death, the destruction of the Jedi Temple, and each memory threatened to break him. Yet the desert itself seemed to temper him, its vast silence teaching him humility, its unending horizons reminding him that even the deepest wounds were only part of a larger tapestry of existence. And gradually, painfully, he began to find a fragile kind of peace. Time wore on, etching its mark into his beard and hair, softening the lines of his face into the weathered mask of an old hermit. And as the years slipped into decades, Obi-Wan found himself fading from the galaxy's memory, yet his vigil never wavered. For though his life had been stripped of titles, of comrades, of temples and starships, he knew his purpose was not yet finished, and in his solitude, he embraced the truth that sometimes the greatest service one can render is not in battle or in triumph, but in waiting, enduring unseen, so that when the time came, the light might rise again. And thus, in the endless sands of Tatooine, Obi Wan Kenobi became the silent guardian, a man of sorrow and patience, a hermit to the world, but a sentinel to the Force, carrying in his quiet watch not only the memory of what had been lost, but the fragile seed of hope for what was yet to come. After decades of silence, solitude, and sorrow beneath the twin suns of Tatooine, Obi Wan Kenobi's long vigil was finally broken by destiny, for when Luke Skywalker stumbled into his path, guided by chance, circumstance, and the will of the Force, it was as if the galaxy itself had exhaled after years of waiting, and the weary hermit who had hidden for so long felt the stirrings of purpose awaken within him once again. It began with the droids, R2-D2 and C-3PO, wandering across the desert sands, carrying within their circuits a desperate message from Princess Leia Organa. A plea for help encoded in words meant for Obi-Wan himself, words that called him once more to be not a hermit, but a Jedi, to rise from exile and answer the galaxy's need. When Luke delivered that message, wide-eyed and unknowing of its significance, Obi-Wan gazed upon him with a mixture of awe and sorrow. For in the boy's face he saw both Padme's compassion and Anakin's fire, and he knew that the time of hiding was at an end. Taking Luke into his hut, Obi-Wan revealed for the first time fragments of the truth, handing him his father's lightsaber, a symbol of a legacy both glorious and tragic, while telling him stories carefully softened to protect him from the terrible truth. Framing Anakin as a great Jedi cut down by betrayal, never revealing that betrayal had come from within. In that moment, Obi-Wan became a teacher once more, guiding Luke's first steps on the path of the Jedi, and though he could see the boy's uncertainty, he could also feel the spark of destiny blazing within him, a spark that promised redemption not only for the galaxy, but perhaps for Anakin's memory as well. Yet the awakening of hope was not without cost, for when Imperial stormtroopers traced the droids to the Lars homestead, Owen and Beru were slaughtered, their moisture farm reduced to ash, and Luke, with nothing left to bind him to Tatooine, stood at the crossroads of fate, ready to follow Obi-Wan into the stars. Together they journeyed to Mos Eisley, that hive of scum and villainy, where Obi-Wan's calm wisdom and sharp blade reminded the galaxy, if only for a flicker, of what a Jedi Knight once was. And in hiring Han Solo and Chewbacca, they set course for Alderaan, unaware that the Death Star's shadow already stretched across their path. Along the way, Obi-Wan quietly began Luke's training, teaching him the first lessons of trust in the Force, guiding his hands with the training remote aboard the Millennium Falcon, reminding him to reach beyond his senses and embrace the current that bound all life together. And in Luke's earnest attempts, he glimpsed the beginnings of the Jedi that might yet emerge. But Obi-Wan knew his time was drawing to an end, for as they approached the Death Star, as he felt the oppressive presence of Darth Vader, Anakin twisted and remade, he knew that his final role was not to stand as a warrior, but as a bridge, to ensure Luke's survival and growth, even at the cost of his own. On the Death Star, as he crept through the halls, disabling tractor beams and guiding his companions to safety, Obi-Wan felt the inevitability of his path settle upon him, and when he finally faced Vader, lightsaber to lightsaber, master against fallen apprentice, there was no anger in his strikes, no bitterness in his parries, only the serenity of acceptance. Their duel was not the furious storm of Mustafar, but a calm, deliberate rhythm, Obi-Wan defending with measured precision, Vader pressing with mechanical strength, and all the while Luke, Leia, and their companions raced toward escape. Then, in the quiet heartbeat between strikes, Obi-Wan lifted his blade in salute, meeting Anakin's burning gaze one final time, and with a calm smile he surrendered himself to the Force, allowing Vader's blade to cut through him, his body vanishing into nothingness, his spirit becoming one with the living Force, free at last from the prison of exile. To Luke it was a loss, but to Obi-Wan it was fulfillment, for in that sacrifice he ensured that the boy would live, that hope would endure, that the light would not fade, and as his voice later whispered across the stars, "Run, Luke, run." Obi-Wan Kenobi became not merely a Jedi, but a legend, his presence no longer bound to flesh and bone, but woven into the current of the Force itself, guiding, teaching, and watching still, the hermit transformed into the eternal guardian he had always been destined to become. The awakening of hope did not end with Obi-Wan Kenobi's selfless sacrifice aboard the Death Star, for in many ways it was only the beginning. And though his body was gone, his spirit lingered, woven into the very currents of the Force, watching over Luke Skywalker as the boy grappled with the enormity of what had been thrust upon him, guiding him in whispers that pierced the veil between life and death, a presence that reminded Luke he was not alone. For Obi-Wan's final act in life had not been the extinguishing of his flame, but the passing of that flame into the hands of the next generation, ensuring that the light of the Jedi would burn again. In Luke's wide-eyed grief, Obi-Wan saw echoes of Anakin's youthful passion, yet also the steadiness of Padme's spirit, and though he could no longer stand beside him with a guiding hand or a protective blade, he could nudge him from beyond, urging him to trust the Force, to take the first faltering steps down the path of destiny. Aboard the Falcon, as Luke mourned the loss of the old hermit who had revealed to him his father's weapon and whispered of the ways of the Jedi, Obi-Wan's voice stirred within him, faint but steady, anchoring him in faith. And that same voice echoed again in the trench above the Death Star, urging Luke to turn off his targeting computer, to trust in the Force. And in that moment, Obi-Wan's faith was rewarded, for the boy reached beyond machines and instruments, beyond fear and doubt, and allowed the living current of the Force to guide his hand, unleashing the shot that destroyed the Empire's weapon and rekindled hope across the galaxy. Obi-Wan, watching through the Force, felt both pride and sorrow. Pride that the boy he had guarded in silence had already become the spark of rebellion. Sorrow that he could not be there in flesh to share the moment. Yet he knew this was as it must be, that his purpose had always been to prepare, to guard, to hand over the torch, and now Luke would carry it forward. But even in this victory, Obi-Wan understood the road ahead would be long and fraught with peril. For Vader still lived, the Emperor's shadow still loomed, and Luke's training was only just begun. And so from beyond, Obi-Wan remained a constant presence, his spirit lingering to guide not only Luke, but also the galaxy itself toward the balance the Jedi had once sought. The hermit who had lived in silence, who had once felt his story had ended in failure and loss, now found new meaning beyond the veil, for he had become part of the eternal stream of the Force, his voice now unbound by time or distance, his wisdom no longer confined to his frail, aging body. And in this transcendence he found peace at last. Peace in the knowledge that his long vigil had not been in vain, that hope had indeed awakened, and that through Luke, through Leia, and through the rebellion rising from the ashes, the future of the galaxy was being written anew. The moment of Obi Wan Kenobi's last confrontation with Darth Vader aboard the Death Star was not merely the clash of two warriors, but the culmination of a lifetime of love, loss, and destiny. For when their sabers ignited and blue met red in the sterile corridors of the battle station, it wasn't the furious storm of Mustafar that replayed itself, but something quieter, sadder, and infinitely more profound, as if both master and fallen apprentice understood that their paths had led inevitably to this final meeting. Obi-Wan, older now, his body weathered by decades of desert exile, did not strike with the vigor of youth, but with the measured calm of a man who had long accepted his place in the great current of the Force, while Vader, clad in the black armor that had remade Anakin Skywalker into a mechanical terror, pressed forward with heavy, deliberate blows, the rasp of his breath filling the chamber, his strikes driven less by anger than by the relentless certainty of a man who had surrendered himself wholly to darkness. Each movement between them was weighted with memory, Obi-Wan parrying with the same precision that had once taught Anakin patience in training halls, Vader countering with power that recalled the boy's reckless ambition, and in every exchange lingered the echoes of the bond they had shared. A bond now twisted and broken, yet not fully erased, for in Vader's relentless assault there was still the shadow of the brother he had once been. And in Obi-Wan's serene defense, there remained the love of a master who had never ceased mourning the boy he had lost. Around them, stormtroopers and rebels alike watched in awe, their blasters silenced by the spectacle of sabers flashing. But Obi-Wan's attention was not on victory. His gaze often flickered toward Luke, watching from the hangar bay, and in those glances lay the truth of his intent. For Obi-Wan knew this duel was not his to win, that his purpose was not to strike Vader down, but to ensure Luke's escape, to buy the seconds needed for hope to flee the Death Star's grasp. And so, with every parry and retreat, he led Vader further from the docking bay, his every movement not the desperate defense of a cornered man, but the deliberate steps of one guiding events toward their necessary end, until at last, when he sensed Luke and his companions were free, he lowered his saber, lifting it in a gesture of surrender, his eyes meeting the black lenses of Vader's mask, though in his mind's eye he saw still the young man on Mustafar, consumed by fire, the boy he had raised from childhood, the friend he had loved beyond words. With a final, calm breath, Obi-Wan let go of fear, of sorrow, of the clinging weight of flesh, and as Vader's crimson blade cut through him, his body vanished into the Force, leaving behind only empty robes and the lightsaber that had once been his faithful companion. Yet in that instant he was not destroyed but transformed, his consciousness dissolving into the living Force, becoming part of the eternal current, and his voice, soft and steady, whispered to Luke, "Run, Luke, run," carrying across the hangar like a guiding hand. In that moment, Obi-Wan's death became his greatest victory, for he denied Vader the satisfaction of conquest, denied the Empire the triumph of parading his corpse, and instead became something greater than either warrior or hermit. He became an eternal guardian, a luminous presence that would walk beside Luke in every trial to come. To Vader, it was a bitter and hollow moment, the destruction of a ghost who had haunted his memory. But to Obi-Wan, it was peace at last, the fulfillment of Qui-Gon's promise, the realization that his watch had never been for nothing, that every scar and sorrow he had carried had led to this act of selfless surrender, the final passing of the torch to the boy who would redeem not only the galaxy, but, perhaps in time, the shattered soul of Anakin Skywalker himself. The duel with Darth Vader aboard the Death Star did not end when Obi-Wan's body vanished into the Force, for its ripples stretched outward through every soul present, and even further across the galaxy, becoming a moment of legend that would echo for generations. And in truth, the battle had never been about sabers or strikes, but about what each combatant represented: Vader, the embodiment of tyranny, power, and despair, and Obi-Wan, the embodiment of patience, sacrifice, and hope. And though to the onlookers it may have seemed a clash of blades, to Obi-Wan it was the culmination of his entire life's journey, a final act of service that transformed defeat into victory. As Luke and Leia fled with Han and Chewbacca, Obi-Wan's surrender of his body into the Force became the final lesson he could give his young pupil. That true strength did not lie in clinging to life, in wielding power, or in striking down enemies, but in letting go, in becoming one with a greater whole, in allowing selflessness to triumph over fear. And in this lesson, Obi-Wan hoped Luke would see not only the way of the Jedi, but the way forward for the galaxy. To Vader, striking Obi-Wan down should have been a triumph, the culmination of decades of resentment and pain against the master who had left him to burn on Mustafar. Yet, when Obi-Wan's robes fell empty to the floor, when there was no body, No death scream, only silence and the fleeing rebels. Vader felt a hollow pang, an echo in the Force that mocked his supposed victory, and deep within his armored shell, the faintest flicker of Anakin stirred, confused, unsettled, angered by what he could not comprehend. For Obi-Wan, in merging with the Force, found liberation he had long sought. The burden of exile, the loneliness of the desert, the sorrow of Anakin's betrayal, all dissolved into the luminous stream, and he discovered the peace Qui-Gon had promised long ago. That death was not an end, but a transformation, a return to the eternal flow that binds the galaxy together. And in that peace, Obi-Wan's presence became sharper, clearer, no longer dulled by the weight of flesh, but radiant, reaching across stars, whispering guidance into Luke's heart in moments of need. Yet even in this transcendence, he did not forget the weight of his duel, for his sacrifice was not merely for Luke's escape, but for what it symbolized, that no matter how powerful the Empire seemed, no matter how absolute Vader's dominance appeared, the light could not be extinguished, for even a lone hermit stripped of army, temple, and order could still stand in defiance and turn surrender into victory. This duel, quiet and deliberate, was thus not only Obi-Wan's end, but the rebirth of the Jedi way. Not in grandeur or armies, but in the courage to let go and to believe that even in death, one's actions could light the way for others. Luke would carry that moment with him, haunted and inspired, his heart aching with grief for the mentor he barely knew but already loved. And in his future trials, when fear and doubt threatened to break him, it would be Obi-Wan's calm surrender, his serene acceptance in the face of overwhelming darkness, that would remind him what it truly meant to be a Jedi. And so, though Obi-Wan's final duel ended with the fall of his saber and the sweep of Vader's blade, its true end was written in the hope that blazed anew in Luke's heart. A hope that would grow to challenge the very foundations of the Empire, proving that the hermit who had once faded into the sands of Tatooine had never been defeated, for his spirit endured, guiding, teaching, and loving still, a beacon in the Force that would never fade. The legacy of Obi Wan Kenobi did not end with the sweep of Darth Vader's crimson blade aboard the Death Star, nor with the empty robes that fell to the floor, for in truth, his story transcended death itself, carried forward in the luminous current of the Force and in the hearts of those he had touched, becoming a light that guided the galaxy long after his physical form was gone. And in many ways, his influence was greater in death than it had ever been in life. For when Obi-Wan surrendered himself to the Force, he became one with the eternal stream, joining Qui-Gon Jinn in the mysteries of immortality, and from that place of luminous peace, he reached out to Luke Skywalker, whispering words of comfort and guidance at moments when the boy's courage wavered, urging him to trust the Force, to rise when he faltered, to believe when fear clouded his vision. His voice was first heard in the echoing halls of the Death Star Trench, telling Luke to let go of his targeting computer, to trust his instincts, and through that whisper, the galaxy was saved. The Death Star destroyed, and hope renewed. And in that moment, Obi-Wan's spirit became forever linked to the rise of the rebellion. Yet his guidance did not cease there, for as Luke grew, Obi-Wan continued to serve as mentor and guardian, appearing to him in visions, offering counsel on Dagobah when Luke sought Yoda, reminding him of his heritage, his destiny, and the difficult truths he would need to face about his father. To Luke, Obi-Wan was more than a ghost. He was the embodiment of the Jedi's enduring light, a steady hand reaching across the veil of death to keep him steady on the path. And beyond Luke, Obi-Wan's legacy rippled outward, shaping the galaxy itself, the rebellion. Inspired by the courage of those he had helped rescue, grew into a force capable of standing against the Empire. Leia, though she did not know him deeply, carried within her the hope he had preserved. And even Vader, though hardened and consumed by darkness, could never fully escape the memory of the man who had loved him like a brother, and still in death defied him by becoming more than he could ever understand. In this way, Obi-Wan's presence was felt in every major turning point that followed. His unseen hand guiding Luke at Yavin, his voice encouraging him to seek Yoda, his counsel reminding him of the truth of his heritage, his legacy shaping the decisions that would one day redeem Anakin Skywalker himself. For when Luke stood before Vader and the Emperor, refusing to strike in hatred, choosing compassion instead, it was in part the lessons of Obi-Wan that had given him the strength to stand firm. And so Obi-Wan's legacy was not carved in monuments or recorded in the annals of history, but lived in the choices of those who carried the light forward, in the resilience of the rebellion, in the courage of Leia, in the compassion of Luke, and ultimately in the redemption of Anakin Skywalker, whose return to the light brought balance to the Force and fulfilled the prophecy Obi-Wan had once believed broken beyond repair. Through it all, Obi-Wan remained a silent guardian, no longer bound by flesh, but present in spirit, a voice in the stars, a watcher in the current, reminding the galaxy that hope, once lit, can never truly be extinguished. His hermit years, his sacrifices, his battles, his losses, all of it found meaning in the legacy he left behind. A legacy not of war or conquest, but of faith, endurance, and love. And in this way, Obi Wan Kenobi became eternal. A Jedi whose light would never fade, whose presence would echo in every generation that rose to defend the galaxy. A legacy beyond death itself. Obi-Wan. Kenobi's legacy beyond death was not confined to the whispers Luke Skywalker heard in moments of need, nor to the fleeting glimpses of his robed figure shimmering in the Force, but extended far deeper, becoming the invisible thread that wove together the destiny of the Skywalker family and the rebirth of the Jedi way. For though his body had vanished, his spirit endured, luminous and eternal, guiding events in ways both subtle and profound. When Luke traveled to Dagobah, uncertain and searching, it was Obi-Wan's voice that led him to Yoda, ensuring that the boy would receive the training he himself could no longer provide. And in that guidance, Obi-Wan was both teacher and bridge, connecting master and student across the veil of time, ensuring that Jedi tradition survived. His presence became Luke's compass in the storm, offering reassurance when doubt gnawed at him, steadying him when fear clouded his judgment, reminding him always to trust in the Force. And though Obi-Wan sometimes held back truths, such as the full revelation of Anakin's fall, it wasn't out of deception, but out of a desperate attempt to shield Luke from burdens too heavy for one so young. For Obi-Wan knew intimately the crushing weight of responsibility and could not bear to place it upon the boy too soon. Yet in time, the truth would come. And when Luke learned that Darth Vader was his father, Obi-Wan appeared once more, not to scold or command, but to explain with sorrow and compassion, acknowledging the failings of his own choices, confessing that from a certain point of view he had spoken half-truths. And in that confession, Obi-Wan's humanity shone through. No longer the untouchable master, but a weary soul still learning, still wrestling with mistakes, yet still striving to serve the greater good. Beyond Luke, Obi-Wan's legacy rippled even into Vader himself. For though Anakin had buried his past in armor and shadow, the memory of Obi-Wan remained, haunting him with the image of the man who had believed in him, the brother who had tried to save him, and though Vader would never admit it aloud, that ghost gnawed at him, a reminder that love had once defined his life, and that memory would play no small part in the eventual breaking of his chains when Luke's compassion reached him. In this way, Obi-Wan's influence extended beyond the light, touching even the heart of the darkness he had once failed to prevent, proving that love, though buried, was never fully lost. And so, as the rebellion grew, as Luke trained, as Leia rose into leadership, as Han and Chewbacca found their place among heroes, Obi-Wan's presence lingered in every triumph, unseen but essential, his spirit watching, nudging, encouraging, a reminder that the Jedi way was not dead, but reborn in a quieter, humbler form. His life had been marked by battles, wars, and sacrifices, but his legacy was something gentler. The faith that endured after him, the compassion that outlived him, the hope that blossomed because of him. And in this way, Obi Wan Kenobi became more than a man, more than a knight, more than a hermit. He became an eternal guardian in the Force, a quiet light that would never fade, whose love, wisdom, and sacrifice continued to echo across generations, reminding all who walked in darkness that there is always a path back to the light. Even after all the battles had been fought, after the twin sons of Tatooine had watched over his long exile, after the clash with Anakin on Mustafar and the final surrender to Vader aboard the Death Star, Obi-Wan Kenobi's story did not end, for his light lingered still, not bound by flesh or bone, but woven into the eternal stream of the Force, a guardian who continued to watch, to guide, to love in silence. He had lived as warrior, as mentor, as hermit, and as sacrifice, and in each of those roles he had carried both triumph and failure. Yet in the end, what endured was not the pain or the regret, but the compassion that defined him, the devotion to others that carried him through loss, the belief in hope even when all seemed lost. From beyond, he watched Luke Skywalker walk the path he had once prepared, stumbling at times, rising stronger at others, growing from a wide-eyed boy into the hero of the rebellion. And Obi-Wan's spirit whispered encouragement in those quiet moments when fear threatened to overwhelm him, reminding him to trust the Force, to hold on to faith, to remember that the light of a Jedi is not measured in victories, but in the willingness to stand firm against darkness. He saw Leia too, though she had known him only briefly, rise into the fierce leader her people needed, carrying forward the same courage he had glimpsed in her parents, and in her resolve he found solace. For she embodied the strength of the Republic he had once fought to defend. He even watched Anakin, now Darth Vader, from a distance, sorrow and love forever entwined within him, knowing that though the man he had raised seemed lost, the faint ember of good remained, and in Luke's compassion that ember would one day reignite. Obi-Wan's legacy was thus not of war but of endurance, not of conquest but of care. And as the galaxy turned, as the rebellion grew, as stars flared and faded, his presence remained, a quiet watchman in the Force, a light that did not command, did not control, but gently guided, trusting that those who came after him would choose their own path with wisdom. To the galaxy, he was a hermit, a knight, a martyr. To Luke, he was a teacher and friend. But within the vast current of the Force, Obi-Wan was simply what he had always sought to be, a servant of the light, humble and steadfast, a reminder that even in the face of despair, hope can endure. And so, when you close your eyes and drift into sleep, imagine him still, an old man beneath the stars, a soft smile beneath his beard, his presence warm and calm as he keeps his silent vigil, not for glory, not for recognition, but for love of a galaxy he gave everything to protect, a light that watches still, unyielding, eternal, and forever at peace.